I love that telling of the story in John of the resurrection because it's told that Mary Magdala is the first at the tomb. Now, Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, was Mary who came from Magdala. And Magdala was where the Roman camp, the Roman occupation, had their dwelling. That's where she came from. So you can imagine the life that she led as a Palestinian with the Roman occupation, and she worked for them as a prostitute. That's what she was. And that name followed her for the rest of her life, wherever she went. Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. And it was to her that Jesus first showed himself. And what's beautiful about that passage is it's not only the first time he showed himself to anyone, but she didn't recognize him. She thought that he was the gardener. He was the one who beautified the earth. He was the creator. He was the one that looked after the environment. That's who he came to her as. And the only way she recognized him was he named her. He said, Mary. And so she turned to him. It's beautiful. But I want to tell you stories, different stories, from my first internship. It's a long, long time ago in a place far, far away called Stouffville. And Stouffville at that point was not a commuter town. It was a little rural hamlet, and it was mainly farmers. And I had this fantastic supervisor. His name was Wayne Reed. He was amazing, made every mistake possible, kind of just like now. And one of the first mistakes I made was it was the first time I used a hands-free mic. And so I had this hands-free mic on, and I went to the washroom just before the service. You can imagine what happened. There was this huge flush throughout the congregation. And everybody thought I was going to be preaching on Noah. Wasn't the case. And then Wayne said to me, like a good supervisor should, I'm so glad it happened to you. I was always frightened it was going to happen to me. So that was story number one. Story number two was the very first wedding I officiated, and I and he were going to officiate together. And it was at the cottage of one of our parishioners. And they were going to walk out of the cottage down to the dock, and there was a lovely little altar set up at the end of the dock, and that's where it was going to take place. And Wayne and I were going to walk out together. Now, Wayne was about 6'4", and about 350 pounds easy. He was a big man. And then there was little old me. And we didn't know what the music was going to be until we took our first step out. And so we took our first step out and started walking, and the music was Disney's Here They Come, Beauty and the Beast. And of course, for the rest of the summer, the discussion was who was who. And then the third story from my first internship was about the dairy farmer. Now, this was just after 1988, when the United Church of Canada made a very, very brave stand, and that was to ordain openly gay and lesbian folk, which is why my family walked into that church. And we lost about a third of our members in doing that. Many of them never came back. And one of them was this dairy farmer. He stayed away. He didn't want to come to church because of that. So Wayne thought this would be a good learning exercise to go out and visit him. So we did. We put on our big rubber boots. We went to the barn. We visited, let's call him Jim, the dairy farmer. And so the first words out of Jim's mouth were to Wayne, and he said, so I hear you're going to start marrying them homosexuals. And Wayne's immediate response, without missing a beat, was, yeah, we are, Jim. You got somebody in mind? That was the kind of guy he was. But there is another story from my first internship, and that was a visit to this lovely elderly woman in a long-term care facility. She was almost 90 at the time. Lovely individual. I brought my daughter with me. She used to do trips with me back then. And she loved this woman. They developed quite a bond. But the very first visit that I made to her, she asked me, after making some small talk, this question. She said, for 30 years I was married to the man of my dreams. We loved each other so much. We had everything in common, and mostly he was my very best friend. And I lost him a long, long time ago. And I don't have much time for church unless you can answer me one question. And the question is, will I see him again? Now, I was just a first-year student. And I had my head full of philosophy and theory back then, theology. All the books I'd read. And the question was, how would I answer? Gonna have to wait. The three questions really are this. Is there eternal life? What does that mean? And how do I get me some? How do I qualify? A couple of things before I begin, and one of them is this. It's the old Hindu story of the three blind men and the elephant. Some of you have heard it before. And it goes like this. There are three blind men, and they are approaching an elephant for the first time, and one feels the trunk and says, an elephant is like a boa constrictor. And the other feels the tongue of the elephant and says, an elephant is like a mollusk, a big clam. And the other feels the leg of the elephant and says, the elephant is like a tree. They're all wrong, of course. So when we speak about the unspeakable things, we are like those blind men. But here's the kicker. There actually was an elephant in that room. They just didn't get it right. When I was a little girl, I used to worry about death. I think I had some elderly relatives. It's not unusual for children to worry about death, especially of people they love. And I always thought that heaven would be just like Bedford Road. I grew up on Bedford Road. I always thought it would be just like Huron Street Public School, and I would come home, and my parents would be there, and it would just go on forever, and I would never lose any of them, and they would be just like that. And I realize now, looking back on that little girl, that we don't have a lot in common, because my conception was that my little ego would go on forever, and that it would always be the same, and that there would be no change and no difference in that little ego. And I realize now there's really not a lot in common between me and her, or even me and her in her 20s, or even me and her in her 30s, that we are different. So keep that in mind as well. And also keep in mind the biblical phrase from 1 John, God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God. So God is not some old master manipulator, no puppeteer. God equals love. That makes a lot of things easier. But I'm going to say something. So not like the joke, not like what do you get when you cross a United Church minister with a Jehovah's Witness. Somebody comes to your door, and when you open it, they say nothing. No, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to say something. Here's what I'm going to say about eternal life. You know, if there is a God, that creative force of love that is worth worshiping, that's gathered us all here today, whatever we believe, in questioning approach, in hope, in peace. If there is that force of love, then that force of love is a force of justice. Because if it's not a force of justice, then what's the point of church? What's the point of any great faith? So if it's a God of love and justice that brings us here, then it is a God greater than this life only, absolutely. Because we know that in this life we rarely see justice, and some of us rarely even see love. That if this life is all that there is, then this God is a master manipulator, and an evil one at that, and our only answer is nihilism. But if it's a God of love and justice, then of course it's greater than this life. And if you want to talk about miracles, I'm looking at a church of them right now. I saw this TED Talk once with a scientist, and he said there is a 1 in 400 trillion possibility that any of us were ever born. 400 trillion. It's a scientist, you should know, and it's a TED Talk, must be true. 400 trillion. That's a miracle. We are miracles. This existence for each of us is a miracle. That's like winning the lottery every time you buy a ticket. It's a miracle that we're here. And if this God of love and justice is that same creative love force that put the cosmos into place, that created planets, black holes, everything, if this God has that power, that creative force of love can do that, then why do we prevent that same force from walking out of a cave as a Palestinian rabbi? That seems like a magic trick to me in comparison. Or why do we prevent that force in our intellects only, from coming to a woman as a baby without any man being around at all? Why do we insist that couldn't have happened? If this God that we worship can create universes. Want to feel even better? If you're making over the poverty line in Toronto, you are among the 1% of the wealthiest people in the world. Did you know that? That's how impoverished our world is, but that's how blessed and lucky you are. And this is not the lead into the offering, just saying. And if you live to be 60, you are going to outlive 3/4 of the world's population. Yes, you will. So how blessed are we this morning? What miracles we are. Yeah, but how do I qualify? I want me some. Martin Luther talked about works righteousness, and I've talked about that a lot because I'm a big fan of him. He's kind of the punk rock of theology. He said things like, sin boldly, but love Christ more boldly still. But he talked mainly and mostly, the Protestant Revolution was about works righteousness versus faith and grace. That you couldn't work your way to God, that there was nothing you could possibly do that would get you there, that there's nothing you can do to qualify for eternal life or anything else that's good, that it really is grace, that it's a gift. It's a gift we're given, like the 1 in 400 trillion chance we're here. We didn't do anything to earn that. That's a gift to you. Everything that you are and will be is an absolute gift. Even faith or no faith, again, a gift. What we do with our lives is just a thank you for the grace that we've already received. Gil and I went to the Dismas Fellowship on Friday night. It was the last service of the day for us. It was the smallest. And the Dismas Fellowship, named after Saint Dismas, named after the apocryphal name of the thief that died next to Jesus on one of the crosses. It wasn't just any thief. He lived a terrible life, one can imagine. Lots of criminality, not much fun, not much love. He was maybe, let's imagine, a very evil person. But that day, he did one thing only. He turned to Jesus and he asked him about salvation. He asked him about eternal life. And Jesus said the words that converted me, because I thought they were a lie when I was an atheist, but the most beautiful lie ever told. Jesus turned to him and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Not tomorrow, today. So what did Dismas do to earn that? Nothing. Didn't do nothing. He just turned. The same way that Jesus turned to Mary and named her. It was just a slight turning. That's all he did to recognize that everything, that heaven was his. Do anything. One of the most beautiful things that's happened in the last couple of weeks was the March for Our Lives. Wow. Amazing, gives us, should give us such hope. And one of the kids from that march said these words. And, it came up on social media and then went away. And honestly, if you know who said it, let me know, because I couldn't find out who actually said them. Maybe Christ was risen and it was Jesus. These are the words. Every star exploding, every planet colliding, every molecule combining, every quantum occurrence, every life that lived, every adaptation, every evolution, every species, every birth, every death, every thought, every action and realization by anyone who has ever lived leads us to this question, the real question: what will you do with this moment. How beautiful is that? The other thing I was thinking about as I was preparing this sermon was Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end of Ulysses, but it's a little bit too racy. She talks about her breasts, and opening her breasts, and his heart beat madly, madly. But you can keep the heart beating madly, madly in your thoughts as I go back to that woman who I visited at my internship, my very first summer. Because, as I say, she was about 90 at the time, and she'd been missing her husband, her best friend, for a long, long time. And my daughter said to her, in a kind of obvious question that a young person would ask, well, in all the time that you've been missing him, didn't you think about dating? And she pointed around. We were sitting in the restaurant of the long-term care facility. She pointed around. There were a few elderly men. Then she said, "What, them?" She said, "No." I think most of them were younger than her, but that's okay. So there's only one Christian answer to her question, isn't there? And I could feel it despite all my reading, all my life, and all my thoughts, and all my reason. I could feel it bubbling up. And it's the same answer to the question, will justice win? Will love overcome hate? Will the oppressed rise up and overcome the powerful? Will every act of selflessness and compassion see its reward? Will our suffering and our loss and our misgivings and our fear be answered by joy? Will this moment be remembered as one of a million moments when we, the beloved ones, see the gleam of a new world just about to unfold? Will everything we do in our lives toward that new earth and new heaven be triumphant? We who are the miracles of creation have our answer. What possible cause or justification would we have to answer in any other way? Yes. 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 And like Molly Bloom, confronted with love, like Mary of Magdala, who was forced to carry that name her whole life. Yes, like the one that's risen in your life that you might meet as you leave this place, or maybe sitting next to you in the pew. The answer to them is yes, too. The answer is yes to everyone who calls out for justice, yes. The answer is yes to every possible act of love and compassion in our lives. The answer is yes. Yes, yes, she said, and her heart was beating madly, and so was his. And she said, and we should always say, along with those million children who marched just to save their own lives, yes, yes, absolutely, unbelievably, yes, yes, yes. Amen.